Good morning. Been fighting to get this. I don't have a tripod or a phone stand, so I'm always struggling to get this goddamn thing set up right. Excuse my language. Forgive me. Anyways, good morning. God bless. Peace be with you. Not really sure what I want to say. Sometimes I just want to sit in the morning and just be peace. So maybe let's try that. You cannot fight the mind and win. Cannot fight the mind. And that is good news in a sense, because it means it's not you don't need to suit up for battle. It's not about conquering or vanquishing the mind, at least not in that sort of active militaristic sense, bellicose sense. And you cannot, and so you need not fight it, is another way to say that. It could also be seen as not so good news for the sort of achievement-oriented mindset, triumphal approach. And there's a few things that come to mind when talking about that. One, and there's some truth to it, what you resist persists, and presenting an oppositional front to the mind, to thoughts, to you're just trying to sort of rigidly shut down the mind. And yeah, that approach, that oppositional approach, some sense well, it's not a useful approach. It's not going to ultimately bring peace. I'm not sure exactly what I want to say about that, but part of it is because it's like I've talked about in other videos, the mind. So we run into terminology challenges here. In this sense, I'm using the mind kind of as a synonym for the discursive, thought-based layer of consciousness that most of us, most of the time, most of humanity finds itself running around in. And that's actually a fairly shallow layer of creation. It'd be a little bit like trying to trim the tip-top part off of a weed and hoping that the weed would go away. So it's just not an effective approach. It's not, it lacks insight into the structure and the dynamic of the psyche and psychology. When you see that the thoughts are sort of the uppermost layer of a whole psychic, energetic structure, that has much deeper roots, getting into feelings, emotions in the body, in the subtle layers of the body, down into just kind of into this frequency vibrational layer. That's really where the uprooting, that's where the healing, the digesting has to happen. And the thoughts are almost sort of, they can be seen as messengers in a way. You can frame them almost as messengers that when you're having rumination, neurotic thoughts, that there's something deeper to be attended to. But they also tend to serve as a kind of, it's almost like this layer of pollution, this smoke screen, this layer of pollution that tends to capture our consciousness, our identity, our awareness, to keep us out of these more uncomfortable layers. So you can see in that context that fighting the thoughts is really sort of, it's just a superficial approach that mechanically, you could almost say mechanically, psychodynamically, or practically just is not going to work. And so you'll see just different variations of that theme in different meditative traditions, spiritual traditions, different ways of talking about that. Letting the thoughts pass through. You are the sky. The contents of consciousness are the clouds or the weather, and you just let that pass through. And there's a great truth to that. But what you're doing is, by not reacting, jumping at the thoughts, by not engaging or identifying with the thoughts, they become less sticky. They start to move more, and it allows for deeper, the substrata to surface and to begin to be felt and to begin to be healed. So in that sense, you could also say your mind is not your friend. It's a false friend. It's a short-term friend. It's a friend. You know, there's all these different framings, and they're all useful in a certain mood, in a certain place, in a certain time. Sometimes I feel very fierce about, fuck the mind. It's not your friend. You don't owe it anything. You don't have to obey its dictates. It is has dictatorial, totalitarian tendencies, and seeks your destruction. From some perspective, from some certain states, you can get into. That's a really helpful, useful teaching. That kind of ferocity towards those thoughts. And there's another approach, maybe the counterbalancing, counterbalancing, that talks about the mind is just a scared child. You'll hear people say that. Byron Katie, who else? And I guess there's some truth in that. It doesn't feel very true at this moment, but there's truth that at base, there are deeper levels that are motivating the thought, and you heal the fear, you heal the loneliness, you heal the pain, you heal the repressed energies, the anger, the grief. You heal and release those, and then the mind tends to pacify. So there is a truth in that. The mind is kind of a reflection of, it's like the surface of a well that has something that's kind of toxic or poisoning the bottom of the well. Of course, you're going to have toxic, dysfunctional stuff rise up to the surface of the well, but it's coming from a deeper source, and so you want to clean it from the bottom up. Sort of like that. But especially if you've struggled with really obsessive thought patterns, you get into the terrain of anxiety, so-called anxiety disorders, OCD. You just see how out of control the mind can get. It can just become this very brutalizing force in one's life, this enslaving force, and so you don't want to just coddle it, and that kind of softer approach just doesn't sit quite right to the reality you're experiencing. The mind can be so fucked up, it can be so brutal. But again, when you get into fighting, you can start to get into repression. It's a very natural response. You have this kind of hostile energy, hostile force wreaking havoc in your nervous system, in your life, in your actions. And so, yeah, it's understandable that we just fight back and say, screw this, man. And suppress and repress. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why we can go into repression and why we repress. And it's not about condemnation, just about seeing the pattern. But unfortunately, that too is not going to help. Sucks. The whole design is so fucked up, so messed up. As I've said in other videos, I've got notes for the designer. I've got feedback. I would not have designed it this way. I'll say something that is very anti-therapeutic, very anti-Albert Ellis, CBT. But I'm just going to say it. It should not be this way. It just should not be this way. And that's a dirty word, of course, in psychology. Don't should upon me. But it's just such a bad design. But, it is how it is. And repression is not going to help long term. And so you start to experiment with, well, I don't just lay down and do the bidding of this tyrannical mind. Also repressing it, fighting it, posing it on its own terms doesn't seem to help long term. Just get more rigid, more uptight, more angry, and it doesn't seem to lead to cessation or to peace. So what is that third path? What is the other option? And that is surrender to God, to put it one way. Another way to put it is burning, being willing to burn, meaning not identifying with the thoughts, letting them move, letting those patterns that kind of ossify and rigidify and concretize in our mind by just stopping, not giving into the pattern, not running from it, not fighting it, stopping and letting it move, letting it speak through you, recognizing. This is where you start to get into inquiry and you start to ask, is what I am synonymous with these neurotic, mad thoughts in my mind? Am I my thoughts? Is that the Rene Descartes? I think, therefore I am. That's not quite the same thing probably, but am I my thoughts? And you can analyze that and you can sit with that and you can see, well, thoughts come and go. Maybe I seem